Okay, welcome everyone to the Latte Lounge. And today we are going to be talking, as I said, about the impact of menopause in the workplace. We're going to be discussing the employment rights, support and options that are available for both employer and employee with senior employment lawyer at Debenhams Ottaway, Michael Kerrigan. Now, in this session, we're going to be covering everything from understanding your rights, including unfair dismissal and protected characteristics, top tips for how to talk to your manager, and also when you might need to consider a formal grievance. We're also going to be working through all of the support employers should ideally have in place for their employees. So if you're an employer watching this, this is going to be really helpful for you today too. So welcome, Michael. It's lovely to have you here today with us.
Great to be here. Thank you.
And thanks for coming in. Now, before we start, obviously, I've got a lot of questions for you, and I'm sure some of our members do too, but I thought I'm just going to give everyone a little bit of an introduction to you, if that's okay.
Perfect.
So Michael Kerrigan is an experienced senior lawyer at Debenhams Ottaway, helping both employers and employees navigate through the complexities of employment law. He specialises in disciplinary matters, which include helping employers and employees on gross misconduct, misconduct issues and performance review processes. He is also involved in a wide range of employment tribunal cases, including bringing and defending unfair dismissal, constructive dismissal, discrimination, and whistleblowing claims. And in recent years, Michael's been involved in complex disputes around women's rights, especially in the workplace, including maternity and pregnancy discrimination and sex discrimination, acting on behalf of employers and employees. So, Michael, you know, I'm really very pleased that you're here today. It's a very, very hot issue. There's a lot been going on in the media, obviously, you know, even as early as this morning, which we will talk about. Now, before I ask you a whole host of questions, the reason I'm very passionate about this and I have sort of a personal interest is because I know firsthand myself the effects menopause symptoms can have on women in the workplace. Now, a lot of people who are watching, we've got a lot of new members joining us, and they might even not know that, it was my own psychological symptoms that forced me to leave my own job. It was about 5 years ago now. So for those of you watching, what a lot of people don't realize is it's the perimenopause, you know, it's the psychological symptoms that people don't know about. Now, for me, it was things like brain fog, extreme tiredness, very low mood, anxiety, heart palpitations. You know, I wasn't having hot flushes and I was still having periods. And so it's the going back and forward to the doctors and not knowing what was wrong with myself. And almost that feeling of embarrassment of sort of not talking to, you know, my male manager at work. And that whole thing of I'd rather actually leave my job than, you know, have the humiliation of perhaps them thinking, you know, I wasn't fit for purpose. So I obviously want to talk a little bit about, you know, some of the women we've surveyed, but let's start off, what legal frameworks are in place specifically to prevent any discrimination due to perimenopause or menopause symptoms? I mean, is there anything?
Yes, so when you're dealing with the issues arising out of the menopause, that would most likely fall under the Equality Act. So the Equality Act deals with discrimination under over quite a broad range of areas. So what it does is it lists out specific, what they call protected characteristics. So if you have one of those protected characteristics, then you should not be discriminated against on the basis of that particular characteristic. Now, one of the protected characteristics is disability. And therefore, if you are considered to be disabled, then you should not be discriminated against on that basis. There is actually a legal test, there's a definition under the Equality Act as to when you're considered to have a disability. So just to paraphrase, it's where you have a physical or mental impairment that has a substantial and long-term effect on your ability to carry out normal day-to-day tasks. So what does that mean in English? So basically, it's when they talk about long-term, they mean something that has lasted or is likely to last more than 12 months. And they would look at the individual effect on that particular person. So each case is judged on its individual facts. And so in one case, someone going through the menopause may be considered disabled, and in another case, they may not. It depends on the severity of the symptoms and the impact that it has on them personally. An important issue here as well is around knowledge. So is the employer actually aware that this person is disabled? So that can be either actual knowledge, which is ideal, where the employee actually says, I'm disabled, can you please support me? But there can also be constructive knowledge, so where it's so obvious that the employer should have known that there was an issue and should have known that this person was disabled. So if you establish that you're disabled, then you should not be treated less favourably on the basis that you are disabled. And also, once you establish that you are disabled, that may also trigger a duty for the employer to consider reasonable adjustments. So when we talk about reasonable adjustments, what we're saying is that because of your disability, you're put at a particular disadvantage with something in the workplace or how you work. And then is it reasonable for the employer to consider an adjustment to those conditions to remove the disadvantage? So that's the kind of framework that we look at when we're considering menopause symptoms and whether there's any protections available.
Mm. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because the word disability, you know, when I think back to my own symptoms, I never would have described myself as having a disability. Yes. But we've surveyed a lot of women over the last sort of few years, and in a recent survey, 87% of women said that it was the tiredness, lack of energy, the brain fog, difficulty concentrating, and that anxiety that was just stopping them, preventing them from being able to work. Now, is there any sort of legal requirement at the moment for employers to have a menopause policy rather than, falling under that Disability Act? I mean, I almost feel like there should be a separate section, because, yes. I mean, what happens with people who are suffering from depression and their doctor has sort of suggested they're signed off?
Yes, so it's a good question. So, I mean, specifically when you're thinking about things like a menopause policy, it traditionally has been very rare to see that until now, which I think is a very positive thing. So employers would tend to have policies dealing with a wide range of issues. So particularly larger employers would tend to have very detailed handbooks. They would tend to deal with sort of core issues like disciplinaries and grievances. So how do you go about doing that? The thing about these policies is they're a really good idea because it gives employees somewhere to look to see how do I deal with this issue, and also gives the employer something to refer to. So it's a mutual benefit. So you could also have in a handbook things like dress code. You could also have policies dealing with things such as what happens if it snows and you can't get to work. So it's actually, when we think about it now, with the benefit of hindsight, it does seem quite strange that we've never had a policy specifically dealing with something so important. It would normally be covered under an equal opportunities policy, which tends to cover all areas of discrimination, but that's very broad, and all it does is just say, you shouldn't discriminate against anyone on the basis of any of the particular protected characteristics, and what the different types of discrimination are and what you should do if you feel discriminated against. So again, it's not specifically dealing with menopause as an issue in and of itself. Like you say, in the past, perhaps there's been efforts to make people aware of silent or invisible disabilities, but that's never really focused on menopause. So we've had certainly in the last few years a lot more of a debate around mental health, making people aware that just because someone doesn't have an obvious disability, they may be struggling in the background with something. So I think it's good now that this is, there is a discussion about it and people are being made aware of what can be a very, very serious, very, very serious symptoms like you've just described that you experienced.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, we're very proud to have played a small part in making the conversations, getting it out there. We've had obviously the Davina McCall program out there, and there's just social media has allowed us to all share our stories and sort of sign. My colleague Dan Zanzibrink runs the Make Menopause Matter campaign, and one of those campaign aims is to encourage all employers to have policies in the workplace, because we don't want to we don't want to be a burden. We just want to feel better and be able to then just sort of get on with our lives and be productive members. So, if you feel like you're being discriminated against, or you're not properly supported, what would be the first course of action that you would recommend for people to talk to their managers, so that, and also so that employers, avoid any sort of legal action, because obviously, they don't want that either.
No, so I think in employment law, we would normally advise informal action where possible. So I think it's always sensible to try and deal with things as early as possible by having that discussion with your employer, just to make them aware. And thinking back to the points I made about the Equality Act, knowledge is very important. So the sooner you make them aware of the problems, the better for you, and the more of a burden that then places on the employer to actually do something about it, preferably in writing. I think that's always quite helpful, just to make sure that there is written evidence that that was raised at an early stage. Right. If you can get hold of medical evidence, also that's really helpful. I know people aren't necessarily going to want to disclose their medical records, but it's always helpful because it is essentially a medical issue as to whether someone is disabled or not. So having a GP, for example, write a letter to say, these are the symptoms, this is the impact that this is having, and this is, whether or not they feel that they meet the definition even of the Equality Act. Some, GPs are prepared to go that far to make that statement, to say, the effect on this person is so severe that I think that they are disabled. Sometimes they can even suggest adjustments that might be appropriate. So that's quite a good thing to present to the employer, to say, this is the treatment, these are the symptoms I'm having, this is what my GP recommends, can you help? If that's unsuccessful, then you would need to consider more formal action. So potentially raising a grievance. So that then would trigger a formal process. The employer would normally carry out some form of investigation into that. There would then be a formal meeting to decide then whether or not the grievance is upheld or whether it's rejected. You would then potentially have the right to appeal if you've been unsuccessful. So that's the kind of internal process, and then normally there would be a handbook or policy somewhere that you can refer to see exactly what your rights are. But certainly informal action, I think, is preferable if at all possible. If the internal procedures are exhausted and you still haven't made any progress, then you'd need to think about escalating things, and then you'd be looking at potential employment tribunal action.
Mm-hmm. And I think the problem we're having, it's this chicken and egg thing, and this is why we're kind of coming at this from all angles. So it's women sharing their stories, but it's also, we all know now, because we've been talking about it for so many years, that there's no mandatory menopause training at medical school. So GPs are also, there's many doctors, they do an incredible job, but they're not up to date on the latest guidance. So it's great advice to ask for doctors to give supporting evidence, but often we're getting misdiagnosed simply because the doctors themselves haven't put two and two together. So yes. It's one of those things where we've sort of all got to be working together, because it's quite hard to present that evidence. I mean, have there been any legal cases brought or one in connection with these sort of issues?
Yeah, I've got some notes here actually on a very interesting case recently. So there are some statistics which show that menopause cases are increasing, which is perhaps not surprising. We've had this kind of explosion of coverage in recent months, which has really made everyone aware, which is fantastic. So just to give you some statistics, in the Employment Tribunal in 2018, there were only 5 cases which referred to the menopause. And in the first 6 months of 2021, we had 10 cases. So that would put us on course to have 20 over the course of the year. So quite a dramatic increase. And I would think that that's likely to increase again significantly due to all the recent publicity. I think that's going to come from women feeling more empowered to actually have those discussions. And then when they have those discussions, hopefully because of the greater awareness, if they are not getting the support they need, they're more likely then to understand what their rights are and then to pursue tribunal action. So in terms of looking then at, historically, there haven't been that many cases that have been reported in detail dealing with the menopause in the Employment Tribunal, but what has been made clear from the case law is that menopause symptoms can qualify as a disability. And there's a really interesting recent case, which is the case of Rooney v Leicester City Council. and that was heard in the Employment Appeal Tribunal in October this year, so very, very recent. And I think what this case really highlights is the difficulties that women face both in the workplace when they're trying to get support and trying to raise these issues, but then also the difficulties they face when they then try and bring claims in the Employment Tribunal. So it's a really good example of that. So just to give a bit of background, so Ms. Rooney was a social worker. She'd been at the council for over 10 years, by all means, good at what she did. She then began to experience really severe menopause symptoms, including hot flushes, palpitations, sweating, dizziness, and incontinence. And that's just to name a few. There were more. When she tries to raise these issues with her employer, I think a common experience, she felt belittled, she felt there was no support. So for example, she was talking about suffering with hot flushes and her manager just said, oh, I feel hot in the office today as well. Just not really understanding at all. Mm-hmm. She was having to take time off due to the illness caused by her symptoms. And she felt that the response from her employer was really heavy-handed. So they started to take her through a disciplinary process due to her increasing levels of sickness absence. So just to give a couple of examples of the difficulties she faced during the process. So she requested, for example, when there was an occupational health referral, which is a good idea, but she requested that should be with a female. So she said, I feel uncomfortable, as you said today, there's a degree of embarrassment there because of the stigma that's attached to it. So she wanted to speak with another female so she could speak openly without fear of embarrassment. That wasn't accommodated. She then asked that at the disciplinary hearings there be female managers present, again, so she could speak openly about the symptoms that she was experiencing. That wasn't complied with, and at her appeal, so she was issued with a disciplinary warning because of her absences. She appealed to say, well, look, this is completely unfair. You're punishing me for being off, and this is because of the menopause and because of the stress and anxiety that is causing, which is being fueled by then the way that you're treating me. And at the appeal hearing, there were 4 men present, for example. So she just really felt that it was all just falling on deaf ears. No one was really listening to her. So she resigned. She resigned from her employment, and she brought various claims, one of which was for disability discrimination due to the menopause symptoms. So what's interesting is at the first stage of the process, so at the Employment Tribunal, they threw her case out, so they struck it out. And that was on the basis they felt she wasn't disabled, so she didn't meet that test, that definition that I went through at the beginning today. They didn't feel that the symptoms that she was experiencing had a substantial adverse effect on her ability to carry out normal day-to-day tasks, and they even dismissed some of them as being quite trivial. So I think this is, again, reflecting the problems that women face in getting recognition, both with the employer and in the court system. But what's interesting is in October this year, the EAT published their decision. So Ms. Rooney appealed. So she felt the decision of the Employment Tribunal was very unfair. So she appealed to the Employment Appeal Tribunal. And their decision was that the decision of the Employment Tribunal was not fair and was not reasonable. So what they said was, we just don't understand how, based on the evidence that Ms. Rooney gave, that you've reached the decision that you've reached. So, for example, they were looking at what she could do rather than what she couldn't do, which was wrong. So, as many women going through the menopause, she had caring responsibilities, and what the tribunal seemed to consider was that because she was dealing with these caring responsibilities, she couldn't therefore be disabled. These other symptoms mustn't be having a substantial effect on her. So rather than looking at it as someone who was struggling and then struggling with work and also struggling with private life, but having to just get on with it, as so many women have to do, unfortunately, that almost went against her. So that was wrong. And also they said, well, the evidence that she's given is that this was having a horrendous effect on her. So she was having night sweats, insomnia, that then was leading to extreme fatigue, again, as you referenced with your own experience. She was bedridden for days at some point, so had to take that time off as sick leave. So they just said, well, looking at the evidence that was given and the decision that you've reached, we just don't understand how you've reached the decision that she wasn't disabled. So the appeal was successful, and then that's been sent back now to be heard at a new employment tribunal with a new panel. So they've essentially said, look, this needs to be reheard because we don't think that you've dealt with this in the right way. So this is important, I think, for a few reasons. I think it really highlights now that these cases need to be dealt with in the right way, and the experiences that women are having and the symptoms, are definitely capable of falling under the Equality Act. Also, because it's an appeal decision, it means it's from a higher court, which means then that the lower courts are compelled to follow that decision and follow the advice that's been given. So I think it's a kind of a wake-up call, I think, for a lot of employers, and hopefully will give hope to women going through that experience at work. So we're going to have to keep an eye on that decision moving forward to see what the outcome is eventually. It's going to be very interesting to see.
Very interesting, and it's raised so many. I'm listening to that. It's raised a lot more questions than perhaps I had planned to ask you. But what that says to me is so many different things, that we need to educate men. Men have to be part of this conversation as well. Our partners, employers, because if men and boys, my 3 boys knew nothing about it. They're now very well educated, but they just need to understand it, because as I interviewed Dr. Avram Blooming, who wrote the book Estrogen Matters a while ago, and he said that if men suffered from these symptoms, they wouldn't put up with it, and they certainly wouldn't be able to cope at work. So what we're saying is we're not asking for much. We just want to we want to be diagnosed correctly, get the right treatment so we can feel better and just get back to firing on all cylinders. So as I said, we need to educate everyone. It's men, it's employers, it's policies in the workplace, doctors, children, everyone. It's so important.
Yes. I think the irony is it's actually a benefit to employers, because you've got such a large proportion of the workforce, and if they're unwell, that means that their performance is going to be impacted. So from a selfish perspective, if employers look at this, if they actually deal with this positively, women feel supported. They're more likely then to get the sort of treatment that they need. If there's adjustments in place, for example, that then means that you're going to get better performance out of that individual. So it benefits everyone, as well as the individual, of course, feeling more supported and being heard.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's sort of have a little look forward. I mean, what does menopause in the workplace landscape sort of look like in terms of the future and also potential cases which you mentioned? I mean, first of all, when do you think we're likely to hear the result of that case, and what will the implications be if she's wins her?
Yes. I mean, it would be helpful for there to be a clear decision. I think we've already established that it can fall under disability discrimination, but I think the decision when it's published will be very important. In terms of the timeline, it's very difficult to say. The tribunal system is really struggling at the moment with the amount of cases. So it's likely to be a significant period until we actually hear the judgment there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to read just a quick, I think it's more of a comment, but a lady who's watching now says, I'm sure, and I agree with her, I'm sure we'd like to try and avoid raising an issue at work, but if you've raised the menopause and that you're going through symptoms that do affect work, as you've mentioned, and nothing happens, what do I do next? I love my job. I wouldn't like to cause conflict. I've spoken to my manager and made her aware in October, but there's been nothing mentioned since. I had a verbal disciplinary 12 months ago, not knowing I was menopausal at the time. I was diagnosed as perimenopause in 2017.
Yeah, so I think this is exactly the kind of situation that we're trying to avoid, which is where someone has taken the brave step to actually make the employer aware, and nothing has been done about it. So I think we want to avoid women suffering in silence, because that's been happening for too long. And I think it would be sensible to certainly chase that decision up, or chase it up with the employer to say, well, exactly what is happening. Again, could it be escalated to somebody else? Is there somebody else that they could speak with? If not, it may be that a formal grievance is the way forward. Perhaps if touching upon what I said earlier, if it's possible to actually get some medical evidence to support that, to present to the employer, that may be helpful. But it's a shame that women have to do that they have to take those steps, and that all the the sort of running is all the burden is placed on them to do all the running, and you know, we want to get to a situation where as soon as it's raised, the employer is taking positive action, and also, you know, can the employer be proactive in terms of raising these issues, and actually if they see any signs of menopause symptoms, you know, can they ask, are you okay? Is there anything we can do to support? So I think certainly in that case, if you feel like there's nothing being done about it, that it would be sensible to, again, potentially try and deal with it informally again to see what's happening. If nothing's been done, then you may be left with no option but to raise a formal grievance. And I think we want to get away from women feeling that they're being a nuisance, that they are, you know, overreacting. I think this is a serious issue. If you had any other disability, you probably wouldn't feel reluctant to raise it. So why should you feel reluctant to raise it in this situation?
Yeah, and it's funny, I was thinking about, you know, about the Rooney case and how they were saying, you know, well, if she managed to look after, you know,
yes,
all her other, yeah, and that resonates a lot with me, because yes, I managed to feed my kids and make sure they were at school, but okay, then I spent the rest of the day lying asleep on the couch because my symptoms were just, it was just exhausting. I literally couldn't sort of function properly as a human being. So, you know, yes, we managed to keep people alive, but you know, but does that mean that therefore we can cope at work? No, we basically managed the bare minimum, and so again, it's just about understanding and breaking down. I don't like using the words taboo, because I don't even think it is taboo anymore. We've kind of broken that down, but it's just, you know, understanding what's going on. Now, look, what positive steps, you know, and awareness can employers take? What would you advise that they do?
Yeah, I think like you said about sort of educating people, particularly males, to make sure, I think awareness and training is very important. So that's just can be as simple as just talking about what the menopause is, what the symptoms are, the various stages, how to deal with issues if they're reported to you, how to deal with those conversations, what steps can be taken. Education, I think, is very important. That then will create an environment in which women feel more comfortable in raising the issues and discussing them. We talked about menopause policies. I think they're a very good idea. They're still very rare, unfortunately. That is useful because it gives something for the employee and the employer to look at to see how they deal with these types of situations. So I think, yeah, it's all about just creating that environment in which women feel more comfortable about discussing those issues.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, you know, I think we need to get away from almost labeling things and people, because actually what it comes down to is just well-being. It's employee well-being, looking after, you know, your staff, and especially women who perhaps have, you know, got 30 years, you know, maybe even 40 years of fantastic experience, and they're at the peak of their careers.
Yes.
You know, you want to retain that talent and do everything in your power to keep them there. And at the Latty Lounge, we help, you know, we've got some fantastic businesses we're working with ourselves. We're supporting them writing policies, doing some training. And I think one of a really good takeaway tip we've had from a lot of people we've spoken to is creating menopause champions in the workplace. So actually having a point of contact, and a lot of women prefer it if it is a woman, where they're told almost when they join the company, or if it's a long-standing, you know, employment, that, you know, if you're suffering, you know, this person is a menopause champion. And the idea is that those champions are empowered with information to support that employee to stay in the workplace.
Yeah.
What have Debenhams Ottaway done internally to support your female staff and make, you know, awareness amongst the male staff too?
Yes. So yeah, we signed up to a menopause workplace pledge, which is just about creating greater awareness around menopause issues. So we've delivered training to all staff, just to generally make everyone aware. Also, then managers had compulsory training, which was more focused on how to support women going through the menopause, what signs to look out for, and how to offer relevant support, including, you know, any adjustments that may be appropriate, and how to deal with those types of issues. And you mentioned menopause champions there. We're in the process of asking for volunteers to become champions as well, and they will get specific training to make sure that they're someone who could be contacted if anyone is feeling uncomfortable. Often people don't want to discuss it with their line manager, particularly if they're male. So it's important to just create those lines of communication just to make sure people have someone to talk to if they are struggling.
Yeah, well, that's fantastic, and bravo to you. I hope more organisations follow in your footsteps. I've got one other question. We've got time just for one more, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure.
Another lady says that she works 5 days a week, but she's asked her employer if she can do one of those from home, ideally on a Friday or Monday, because she's also, like myself, got 4 kids, is absolutely exhausted, doesn't get very much sleep at all. She said again, like me, she's surviving on 3 hours sleep a night due to her symptoms. And she just feels she needs to be able to work from home. She says she's able to work from home. It's all, remote working in terms of laptop, but her employer is refusing, saying if she can come in for 4 days, she can come in for 5 days.
Okay, yeah, that's disappointing. I think so. I think in that situation, she's tried. She's had the initial conversation. It's not worked. So I think again, if she's able to speak with her GP, perhaps to get some confirmation of the symptoms that she's experiencing, the impact that it's having on her health and well-being. If then she qualifies and meets the definition of being disabled, which it sounds as though she possibly could, that would then trigger the duty for her employer to make reasonable adjustments. As a reasonable adjustment, it doesn't sound as though that's an unreasonable request, but what is reasonable, again, is very fact sensitive and dependent on the size and resources of the employer. If it's a particularly large employer, they're expected to do a lot more than perhaps a very small business with only a handful of employees. But certainly, if again, could she perhaps present a brief business case to the employer to say, well, look, here's I am disabled, here's some medical evidence to support that. Here's why I don't think that me working from home 1 day a week is going to impact business, and this is the positive effect that it's going to have on me moving forward. The employer is only obliged to make reasonable adjustments. I think certainly in the current climate where many people have worked from home with minimal fuss, the technology is there. It does sound as though the employer is potentially being unreasonable there.
Yeah, okay, well, that's really, really helpful advice. Now, one more thing, I do want to very quickly address what's been in the papers, particularly today, and I'm not naming any names and everything, but this particular journalist was saying that maybe we shouldn't actually be flagging these situations at work, and we should just pretty much just struggle on and keep quiet, because employers will stop employing midlife women. Now, to me, that is just the most abhorrent thing to have even said, frankly, because you wouldn't say to someone with a disability, well, don't say you're disabled, because no one will ever employ you. As I've said, and I keep saying, we want to work, we want to give to our employers and have a fantastic midlife. We just want to be able to sort of be looked after, feel better, and then get on. I mean, what would you say about that?
I think it's not particularly helpful. I think we've made a huge amount of progress in the last few months, but there's still a long way to go, both in educating people and creating that environment. I think it's important that we don't lose the momentum that we built up over the last few months, and that we keep that going. I think, like you say, you wouldn't say to someone who's suffering race discrimination, well, don't raise it, because then they might be less likely to employ people from that particular group. It just doesn't seem particularly helpful. I think, suffering in silence has gone on for too long, and I think it is important now that people feel comfortable in raising those issues. Women make up such a large proportion of the workforce. It's just simply not practical, I think, for employers to carry on ignoring these issues. And I think it's very important that women feel comfortable, and I think that they should take advantage now of this environment that we now have, which is far more positive. You mentioned, Davina McCall, we've had Penny Lancaster and many others who are really speaking out, which is really helpful. We have these positive steps. I think that would be a backward step if women take that advice.
Absolutely, and we've all been campaigning really hard, you know, up at Westminster the last sort of 3 years in particular, and the menopause is now going to be, I'm delighted to say, going to be put front and centre of the women's health strategy. So we're making huge strides, and it's so important that we keep this conversation going so that future generations, you know, won't suffer like us, and it will just become second nature to have these policies, and doctors and women and men and children are all educated, and it just goes without saying. So Michael, lastly, where can everybody find out a bit more, you know, about you, should they need to speak to you after today?
Yes, so you can find my details on the Debenhams Ottaway website, and I believe that have also been added to your directory on your website, which has fantastic resources, so they can also get my details there.
Yeah, so that's debenhamsottaway.co.uk, and on the Lassie Lounge website, which is lassielounge.co.uk, you'll find Michael's listing, and you can also follow Debenhams Ottaway on Twitter, Instagram and LinkedIn too. So we're recording this, and we're going to be sharing it on YouTube and on our website later, with embedded in a great piece from you as well, Michael. So thank you very much for coming in today, and thank you for everyone for watching. I really hope it was helpful. It certainly was for me.
Thank you for having me. It's been great.
Take care, everyone, and see you soon. Bye.